I know I'm in trouble. All right, so again, welcome to the second annual Malcolm X Symposium. We just finished a wonderful conversation on Malcolm and radical education, and another piece of the conversation that I think is necessary when we talk and think about Malcolm X is the question of masculinity. And I couldn't think of two better thinkers and real cultural workers on this question of masculinity and gender. And the reason why I think this conversation is important to have about Malcolm is because in so many ways Malcolm is seen as a representation of black masculinity. So many of the ways that Malcolm is talked about, framed, understood, engaged, loved, is as an almost archetype of black masculinity. And so I thought, what would it mean to think through that? What does it mean for Malcolm to be that figure? What does it mean for Malcolm to represent that? What are the affordances of that kind of thought process? What are the constraints of it? What does it mean to think about Malcolm this way? What do we lose by framing Malcolm in this way? We can get into some other pieces of it, but I think those are the big ideas, I think, for me around what Malcolm means. And also a bigger conversation about radical politics and masculinity and the role of gender in a radical politics. So how can Malcolm help us think about the bigger question and the bigger issue? So those are the things that are in front of us, and who do we have with us but some show-enough geniuses on the topic. The first person I'm going to introduce is directly to my left. She is a professor at The Ohio State University. She is the author of a brilliant, award-winning book, Colored No More. She is a brilliant, popular writer, having written on all sorts of issues, from the awful scandal of Daniel Holtzclaw to interesting fare like Beyonce. She's working on a couple of books, one about the 90s and what it means to grow up as a black girl in the 90s. She's also secretly working on a book on the Golden Girls. I'm serious. But she's a brilliant scholar, a brilliant thinker. Please give it up for Dr. Treva B. Lindsey. And to her left is another brilliant scholar, a dear friend as well. Treva's a dear friend too, but he my friend too. Someone who I've known for a very long time. Probably the first black scholar that I got to meet and know. We met in 2002 virtually at popmatters.com when we was both trying to eat right and they ain't feed us much. Mark Anthony Neal is really a role model for me and a mentor of mine, a big brother, and somebody whose work I admire a great deal. He's written many books, from Soul Babies to What the Music Said, which was the first one, Songs in the Key of Black Life, Looking for Leroy, and my favorite, New Black Man, all of which help us really think about and rethink about masculinity. He's an expert on black popular culture. He's a professor. He's a chair professor. He is the what's the first name of Duke?
James B. Duke.
The James B. Duke Professor of African American Studies and the chair of African American Studies at Duke University. Give it up, straight all the way from the BX at Durham, Dr. Mark Anthony Neal. And let me just say one more thing. I love them because she came from Columbus and he came from Durham just for this. So I don't take that lightly. It was a great deal. And I mean that for every single speaker who has come and traveled here for all these panels. They didn't do it for money, because they ain't getting none. But they did it for the love of our institutions and the love of these critical dialogues with the community. So let's get it started, y'all. Why is a conversation about masculinity so significant when we talk about somebody like Malcolm X?
So let's just
go back to Ozzie Davis and his eulogy, where he described Malcolm X as our black shining prince. And we could just think about how many generations of black folks, black parents, have used that as a metaphor to think about what they imagined for their sons and their brothers and their husbands, their cousins, their this metaphor, right, that we aim for. But, you know, Malcolm X was a man, which means that he was human and had all the frailties and challenges and complexities that we expect in humanity. And so we have to be real about who the man Malcolm X was, and also be real about the ways that he transcended his circumstances in pursuit of something that he never obviously reaches because he gets killed at age 39. It's the thing that I always like to remind folks about Malcolm is that Malcolm was a process. He wasn't fully made yet. He was not fully grown yet. How he thought about himself, how he thought about gender and masculinity, how he thought about being a father. And those of you who are fathers out there, right, who, you know, just think about how you thought about being a father when your kids were 2 versus how you think about being a father when your kids are 22 or 42. You know, it's a process. And we didn't get the chance to see Malcolm X fully develop in that sense, right? But he points to something and suggests something more that I think becomes just as important for us to think about than what he actually was at the time of his death.
Yeah, I often think about that Ossie Davis line too, but I also think about it in connection with the various black men that Malcolm is in community with at different points in his life, right? So even going back to when you have him as Detroit Red, he's in community with Chicago Red, which we come to know as Red Fox, right? And these kind of signature kind of black men that in various ways represent different iterations of black manhood throughout the 20th century. So whether we're talking about Sam Cooke, we're talking about Muhammad Ali, we're talking about Jim Brown, these relationships, or even the non-relationship relationship that's often used between him and other civil rights leaders, whether that's someone like a James Farmer or Martin Luther King Jr., that through him we get a more robust discussion of what it means when we're saying manhood, black manhood in specific, and that for him, that process that he's going through is something that relies deeply on him evolving constantly and being in community with people, being in relationship with other black men in particular as he's shaping his ideas about himself, as he's shaping his ideas about gender more broadly, about revolution more broadly. And that sense that going back to that question from the first panel about interiority, that so much of manhood is spoken about in the context of outside of external factors, what's happening to, how we discuss how things are projected onto black men and boys. And I think what's so powerful about Malcolm is that it offers an opportunity for an introspection about interiority, because we get something that we often don't get in a broader context about how black men think about themselves. How he thought about himself in a reflective capacity as he's looking back on his life and how he becomes who he is and who he is aspiring to be. And that he is giving himself second chances, right? He's allowing himself space to grow in that, which I think is something that's really important when we talk about the expansiveness and the possibilities of black manhood reimagined.
There's a kind of, I often hear people talk about wanting men to be like Malcolm. And with that comes a very particular understanding of how Malcolm engaged masculinity in terms of how Malcolm thought about what men should be. I think about Malcolm lectures, particularly in the mid-50s, about fatherhood and equating real manhood to being a certain type of father, real manhood being a certain kind of contribution to the community. To what extent is our conception of Malcolm's manhood tied to very traditional notions of masculinity and manhood, and what are the affordances of that again, and what are the constraints of it? How does that help us? How does that complicate, and perhaps in less helpful ways, how we understand what men should be or what the possibilities are for masculinity?
So Malcolm is a product of a mid-20th century idea of what masculinity is. An idea, at least in terms of black masculinity, that's also framed by this idea that black men have been de-emasculated, because of white supremacy and slavery and a range of other things. When we think about, men of my generation, of a certain age, if you will, about our own fathers and how they thought about masculinity, right? They didn't think about it much differently than Malcolm might have, or any number of men of that age at that time. The idea of playing a certain kind of figure within your household, obviously money earner, but also as a disciplinarian, someone who didn't necessarily show emotion. One of the things that I appreciated when I became a father reading about Malcolm was his daughter, telling the story about Malcolm asking her to stick her finger in his coffee so it would be sweetened a little bit. And that's kind of an idea of Malcolm, that sweetness of his personality that we don't hear enough about, which speaks to the fact that he saw himself more broadly than the boxes that we wanted to place him in. Even when we talk about Manning Marable's biography, in any ways that is problematic or not, when he tells the story of Malcolm X admitting to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad about his anxieties, about being able to satisfy his wife, in the way that we think of how men are supposed to satisfy wives. The fact that he was willing to share that with someone, that interiority piece, in ways that men were not talking about at all, right? Even with their boys. So no one's having that conversation in 1950 or 1960.
Could he have had that with anybody but Elijah Muhammad, though?
And we see Elijah Muhammad's response.
Tell him, because that's interesting. I'm pushing back. I'm not even pushing back. I'm pushing a little bit just because I want to. Because there's this way that Malcolm is being incredibly vulnerable.
Absolutely.
But it's also a way that his conception of masculinity only allows him to be that vulnerable with
someone he sees as a father figure.
But beyond a father figure, right? As God, as the representative of, you know what I mean? Yeah, so to that extent, it's almost like you got to, like I can't tell you that. Right. I'm not gonna call you like, yo, Mark, man, this ain't working out. but if I believe that you were the messenger of Allah,
right? Absolutely.
I mean, that's how you gotta be for my masculinity to be vulnerable enough to tell you, right, this thing ain't working out the way I want it to.
Exactly.
I mean, that's a hell of a thing.
I agree.
Hypothetical.
So, segue. I think that in that conversation, I remember reading that letter, right? Because for a generation of us, right, Malcolm X comes back into a certain kind of popular discourse and conversation via hip-hop for a lot of us, via rap music, via particular articulations of masculinity that come into existence. So to even read this, I'm working at the MLK papers at Stanford, and I'm going through this large body of work in archive, and I come across a copy of this letter. And although it is singularly to this one individual that he's having that, I know my reaction to reading it was like, oh, he wrote that somewhere, right? And he is someone who is being tracked, is being surveilled, is being policed in various ways. So even if it is seen as something that is private and confidential, he's hyper aware of the ways that nothing about him is relegated fully to the private sphere, right? And so it's not that I'm saying he intended for the world to know that this is a conversation that he's having, but for the fact that he's talking about his inability or his anxiety around this possible inability to satisfy his wife, that he's even concerned about satisfying his wife, says something very different in regards to how we even think about sex in the context and intimacy in the context of Malcolm X, right? And because he's seen as the shining, right, our shining black presence, our black manhood incarnate, if some of that is attached to this idea of virility, charisma, who he's seen as this symbol, even within the context of just appeal, right? It is interesting to see him reflect on his own anxieties, right? Anxiety, trepidation, fears, concerns, these intimate emotions that he's laying out to someone who could ultimately respond back in such a way that makes him feel less than in that moment, to make him feel inadequate, because we tie adequacy to things like virility and this seeming ability to portray something, to project something. And so some of that letter for me always just kind of dismantled some of that for me, that this holding up of him as this man, this idea of a man that he's slowly chipping away and trying to get to the human of it, that he's slowly trying to get away to get at the flaws, getting at the complexities, getting at the contradictions, the hypocrisies. And in doing that, the way that Malcolm's doing that throughout his life is by calling out white inhumanity, right? It's not about humanizing himself as a black person, but actually railing against the inhumanity of whiteness towards black people. And so in him claiming and coming closer and closer to this approximation of what he wants to show up as a human being in the world, I think can be seen in letters like that and intimate moments like that.
Mark, forgive me, I cut you off on one part. You were talking about this relationship between anxiety and mental health, even in masculinity. Could you say just a little bit more about what that means? Not just for Malcolm, but even the bigger picture.
You know, so, and you've known me long enough, Mark, you know, if there's any public excuse for me to talk about Jay-Z, I'm gonna talk about Jay-Z. But, you know, let's take 444 as an example. You know, Jay-Z at 49 would be 50, if you could imagine this. Jay-Z would be 50 in December. It's 10 years older than Malcolm was when he died. Jay-Z's 47 years old, right, when he finally decides to go to therapy and explore his interiority and figure out what's going on. You know, 444 is a byproduct. We've never seen that level of interiority in hip hop, and why would we have, right? That's not something that 23 and 33-year-olds normally do. If you're 47, married to the baddest chick in the game, and you got 3 kids, right, and you're realizing that you are someone who is deeply flawed, right, you might have that kind of Jesus moment that he did. I think it's important when you mention, Mark, the part about who he writes this letter to Elijah Muhammad, you know, someone who's literally a God figure. You know, if we could have more information about what that relationship was with Malcolm X and Sam Cooke and Jim Brown and Muhammad Ali in that period of time. I mean, it's 18 months, you know, where they're relatively tight. And young folks don't appreciate who these people were in that moment. Right, that if we had to talk about contemporary comparisons, we'd have to be talking about Jay-Z, Obama, Will Smith, and LeBron, right, in terms of the impact that they had on the culture. And the friendship makes sense, right? Because who else are they going to talk to about these kinds of things, right? As black men, as celebrities, as race men who are expected to hold up the culture in the community in certain kinds of ways. And Malcolm feels that weight more than the other 3, right? Not only because he's Malcolm X, because he's also the oldest one, right? So he's in some ways functioning as a mentor for these 3 other men. We don't have enough examples of those kind of conversations, right? But, you know, we always thought that that was Alex Haley's role. We now know that we don't have Malcolm's full interiority. And the work that we're now beginning to do in the archives, Malcolm in his own writing gives us some inkling of that. In some ways, however problematic Manning Marable's book might have been for some, it does open up a space for us to also go back into those archives and do the work that needs to be worked. You know, going back to Greg Carr's point about literacy, you know, we got a bunch of young folks that understand that part of literacy is actually being able to go in and actually read archives, right? Not just watch a YouTube video about it.
Manning Marable, let's talk Manning Marable. I hear a groan in the crowd. It prompts a very interesting response because the Manning Marable's book, and I reread it on the flight over here. It was 10 hours. I mean, I ain't speed read. It was, and I was specifically rereading it partly for our panel on radical education, because I wanted to think about what Malcolm was reading and who he was engaging. But I think one of the things, the biggest response when Manning Marable wrote his biography of Malcolm X and this life of reinvention, there were people who critiqued the conversations about what Malcolm's own private affairs were about, the ideas about the gap between the autobiography of Malcolm X and what the archives say. And there are some significant gaps between how Malcolm narrates his own experiences and how the archives suggest they do. And I suggest that people look at the archives to the extent that they can. But the thing that set a lot of people off, and the most people off, was this question around Malcolm and sexuality. how do you all make sense of those claims made in the text? And it's not just Many Rebels' book. Bruce Perry's book made similar claims 15 years prior. Michael Erdice's book made similar claims in 96. Shorty Jarvis's book had some stuff in it as well. But it was Manning Marable's book, which was a New York Times bestseller, that mainstreamed a very different narrative of Malcolm than we'd understood before. To what extent are those narratives helpful? To what extent are they hurtful? How do you engage them? How do you make sense of them?
So,
This is where it gets interesting.
Treva doctored for 15 years, and she was my TA in an Intro to African American Studies class 13 years ago, in which we talked about Bruce Perry's work, in this idea that as Malcolm Little, Malcolm X was hustling in the street, performing fellatio on other men for money. And there was a student in the class, now Dr. Amanda Boston, who talked about how just the conversation about that fundamentally collapsed her whole worldview about everything that she thought she knew about anything, right? Let alone Malcolm X. I understand the impulse to absolutely want to reject that narrative. And I'm not here to suggest that you should believe that narrative or not. My question is the what if. What changes about who Malcolm X is and became if that particular narrative is true? What does it do to our idea of a black shining manhood if that black shining manhood is queer, or bisexual, or trans, right? What does that shift, given what we know folks have given to our communities and have sacrificed for our communities and provided for our communities, who they desire sexually, or even just in terms of pleasure, should not change our understanding of the value of those folks.
Let me ask a question. So then the question might be, do we need to know? Because some would argue if that's the point, then why put it in the book? Why not leave that part of Malcolm out and just focus on Malcolm's politics?
Well, I think part of that is that what if you are that black queer man who didn't think that they could see themselves in Malcolm X prior to that narrative, right? It's like, it's the same thing with Martin Luther King, right? A bunch of different figures. But, we have this idea we had this idea of Martin Luther King as someone who was like just pure, right? We don't deal with the chain smoker, right? We don't deal with the fact that Martin Luther King was a man who just quite frankly loved women with big legs, right? And pursued that when he needed to. And, there are a bunch of younger cats, who looked at Martin Luther King and was like, I could never do that. Then they're reading all these stories about King and it's like, oh, damn. Right? I could do that. I could do that and still be, this great person. I think it's important to think about how Malcolm X, when we tell the full story, if we're going to tell the full story, that allows him to speak to so many more people, because we're not solely just defined by our racial identity, right? We are gendered, we are sexual beings, right? We're also class, right? There are folks who love the story of Malcolm X because it is a working class black story, right? That if you're a working class black person, right, you can connect with that story in ways that you might not connect with Martin Luther King because he was never that.
Yeah, I think with that, I also operate from the what if, because one of the issues with the book for a lot of people, right, where are these citations, how are we getting this information, what it is that we know, but beyond even this kind of queering of Malcolm, which I think has a particular significance for how people see themselves in these figures that we talk about, in these historical figures, part of what's being asserted in that is a sex worker argument also, right? Like, it's not solely about an argument about whether Malcolm was queer identified, right? But in these illicit economies that Detroit Red was in, right? And illicit economies, great economies, include sex work, include running numbers, include robbing houses, including that. So if we're only looking at this, Malcolm, that we have this incredibly kind of redemptive almost way that we frame that in terms of what it was for these things he did as armed robbery, and we can see that in certain ways. But we're even kind of re-inscribing an extremely conservative narrative around the role of sex work in the ways that we think about how people show up in the world, right? And not that he now transcends and no longer has to do sex work, which further demonizes sex work in this context, but to say, if that is part of his past, what does that also open up in terms of how we think about our Black liberatory struggles, the ways that sex workers have always had a position within Black liberatory struggles, whether that's through funding things, creating spaces, offering spaces for people. And I think that's important to think about and to include Malcolm in that conversation, whether he was, in fact, a sex worker who also had sexual relations across gender, is not as important as saying to me that someone who's involved in illicit economies is an integral part of Black liberatory struggle. And saying that that possibility for all of us, and we see that manifest time and time again across Black liberatory periods of upheaval, right? When you see these incredible moments. We don't get anywhere without the policy runners. We don't get anywhere without the sex workers. We don't get anywhere without the corner boys. Like, there are ways that all of these illicit spaces of Black existence are so integral to that formation. And in thinking about the complexity of this and saying, I can now see myself in this person because they did X or they did Y. Yes, that's important, but it's also important to say, like, how we engage those complexities and can still offer critique. We can still offer a robust, like, are these things that we're doing in these spaces harmful? How do I become less harmful within my community? How do I become less harmful in these spaces? How do I become less harmful to the people I love? Right? You mentioned Jay-Z in this context. How do I become less harmful on an intimate space, which has political consequences? Right? So thinking about that earlier question about Malcolm having anxieties about his sexual performance or anxieties about perhaps not, that thinking about how that intimate ties into a greater sense of you get to the broader claim of Black women being disrespected. Right? Those two things aren't separate anxieties. They're not separate fears. To think about how you treat the actual person in your life, who you're laying down with, who you're building a life with, and thinking about the broader context in which that woman is disrespected in the broader society more greatly, and then you're trying to create a context in which you're not doing that in your intimate relationships with her. Right? So the intimate and the political are so deeply tethered in the ways that we can think about the possibility of Malcolm beyond this caricature or this symbol of a person.
I want to use two names that help elaborate Treva's point. Maya Angelou, right? To what extent was Maya Angelou politicized by the work that she did as a surgical sex worker and seeing the levels of exploitation? The other name, a name that's not so well known, is Casper Holstein, who was one of the biggest numbers runners in Harlem in the 1920s, who funded the Urban League's Opportunity Awards, their first literary awards in 1923, right? So these illicit economies have played an important role in us even having certain kinds of infrastructures within our communities.
I want to take questions. Who has questions? Raise your hand if you have a question. Okay, we'll take questions and I'll come back. I have another question for y'all, but for time purposes, I want to get some folk in the audience, and I suspect y'all have some critical questions. Let me see those hands. Okay, I'm going to go to the elder first, and I'm going to come back over to you, okay, my brother? And there was somebody in front of him. I got you. So I'll go to my brother here, now. Here, okay?
Regarding definition of masculinity, to what extent do we attribute the wound that nurtured Malcolm to be the man we love so much as being definitive as to his masculinity rather than Malcolm himself? I'm talking about the Nation of Islam. Did it define his masculinity or did he define his own?
Good question.
Absolutely. Nation of Islam played an incredible role in how he thought of himself as a black man, right? The role that the Nation of Islam played in him having a sense of self-respect, the way that he carried himself, his manners. I was someone who came up early in my career with someone who was in the Nation of Islam as a mentor. And the thing that has always stayed with me is the way my mentor always referred to everyone as ma'am and sir. Something that I carry on today as a 53-year-old. When we think about who Malcolm was in public, the fact that, Ozzie Davis, wrong Ozzie, both geniuses in their own right. But the fact that Ozzie Davis described him as our black child had to do with the way that we saw who Malcolm was publicly, right? The fact that we all wanted our children, our male children, to imitate him had to do with the fact that how he carried himself, and a lot of that came from the way that he was trained and socialized within the Nation of Islam.
I would absolutely agree with that, and think every part of who Malcolm is always, as we said earlier, in process. So there's absolutely a significant role that the Nation of Islam plays, and that doesn't go away even when he separates, right, from the Nation of Islam. But there are other factors too that are shaping him. We mentioned the community of men that he's in for short periods of time. It's Red Fox earlier, it's who he's running the streets with. There are all of these, his own father, right? I think that there's something really interesting about the argument around how communities shape our ideas of self and these different entry points for doing that. And I think that Malcolm, as a person consistently in process and consistently reflecting on, am I my best self? For him, it's often about how he's thinking about his manhood. And so I see that as a constant process that he's going on throughout his life. So I think that we can't ever erase the impact of the Nation of Islam. It's all over him in various ways at the point that he leaves us as he transitions. But I think it's important to think about all of these different markers that shape him and the ways that we all are shaped by these different markers in terms of fully realizing and fully actualizing ourselves. And he was kind of mid-process in many ways, but because he's assassinated at such a young age.
Good evening. So my question is, what do we take away from this conversation as a community in terms of creating spaces where people can be vulnerable, whether we talk about males or females? Just in the past couple of weeks, Aisha Curry got dragged through Black Twitter for just being vulnerable. So what is it that we need to do differently as a community so that we can allow people to be fully who they are?
I think it brings a lot to the earlier conversation, the first panel, about where do we create institutions within our own communities where people feel safe to explore their interiorities. They feel safe enough to be vulnerable. And some of these spaces could be across gender. Some of these spaces could be specifically gender. But we actually have to have a radical commitment to creating these spaces for us to have these conversations.
One second.
Because I'll be real with you, right? I'm a college professor at Duke. I got real good health care. I can go see a therapist every Monday. We don't have enough of those spaces in our community where folks can go deal with the mental health piece, but also to deal with the community piece and sharing in what folks are going through in terms of their lives.
I think in addition to those spaces, it also requires us to revisit strong as a concept, and that goes across gender. What that means and how damaging that is for us. We already have a medical industrial complex that reads us as unable and impervious to pain. So when we internalize that in the ways that we handle each other, right, that manifests in very real ways. And vulnerability is part of that conversation. We often talk about resiliency and strength and empowered, these kinds of words which can be somewhat complicated and tricky, but I think that sense of getting down to that root of it, of saying we need to be more gentle with one another because white supremacy surely ain't gonna be, right? There's too much at stake for us not to be gentler with one another, which doesn't mean you don't hold people accountable, right? The practice of love is an accountability practice, right? So to love each other well means we're being accountable to one another. But if we're going to be accountable to one another, we have to be critically honest with one another. And in doing that is not to cause harm, but to actually articulate and start to give ourselves language and vocabulary to be able to articulate when we're hurting, when we're disappointed, when we're angry, when we're sad, that we should have access to the full range of emotions as Black people. But we have to believe that too, right? That internalization of white supremacy's view of us, of kind of patriarchal view of us, will tell us that these emotions are weakness and will lead us in these destructive ways. When in fact, us not owning that, not being in space with that, not creating spaces with that, also becomes a self-destructive mechanism. Where we rely so hard on strength.
I'm sorry, we have time for 2 more questions. One is coming in from Twitter. What? You got Twitter? I got you too, my brother. What does our open enemy do with the type of information that you all are talking about with Malcolm's sexuality? Sound like a couple of y'all had that question.
I know. Well, I guess some answers in the audience.
So I don't think we do ourselves any service as a community not having conversations about how complex we are. You know, some of our stuff is wide open because of Twitter, but you know, some of our stuff has always been wide open. Y'all ever read Gurner Murdale? You know, as an example, Du Bois's Philadelphia Negro, which was the first sociological study of Black folks, they know who we are, right? And we don't do ourselves any service by trying to pretend that our complexity doesn't exist. We have the conversations not because we necessarily are animated by who might hear the conversations or find out what we're talking about, but because as a community, we need to be a better and more loving community. And the complexity of who Malcolm X was allows us to be able to do some of that work.
Yeah, I'm really over, this is just kind of a shorter response, like worrying about what white people think of us. I'm interested in that as a political project, and so we become more loving of ourselves when we're accountable to our complexities and we exist in those spaces. And you know, there's always a way that Black folks also can move on lower frequencies. There are conversations I want to have in these intra-communal spaces where we talk about that, but hiding from something or closeting something as an act, right, as a community to do that does us a disservice because we're allowing white inhumanity to judge our Black humanity, and that shit is just real plain.
Good evening. My name is Brother Gamal Aziz. I'm going to get straight to the point. I'm going to use, as a basis, your terminology. Could you explain to us the phenomenon and the term that you use, the queering down of Malcolm X? What does that mean?
Sure. So, in the context of that book, there's a detailing of him having sexual interactions with men, right? So that's one very surface read of what it means, the possibility of Malcolm X being someone who identifies as something other than heterosexual, right? But I think the queering of him as an actual project means getting beyond this very narrow understanding of who he was as a person that gets beyond understanding Black men as already overdetermined as only having sex with women, only showing up in the world in these particular tropes of masculinity, right? That he's strong, he's virile, he is articulate, he's romantic, whatever these are, that he's assertive, he's someone who's advocating these particular kinds of political points. A queering of him allows for a widened scope of the possibility of who Malcolm might be. Queering a read, for me, of someone like Malcolm opens up possibility as opposed to foreclosing certain understandings of who he was. It gives us a new lens to re-examine his life, to deepen our understanding of him, and to deepen our understanding of his humanity on its own terms, not with our expectations, our norms, our values, our desires, Because we consume Malcolm in particular ways. We consume Malcolm for particular needs. That's why he gets piggybacked up in certain ways. That's why that autobiography has meant so much to so many. There's something that we are consuming and wanting to pull out from that. A queering allows for Malcolm to speak back to us in a different way. It allows for us to reimagine what our relationship can be to his legacy and to thinking about how we move forward in that legacy in more dynamic and open ways.
I have the next question.
I agree.
Oh, I didn't know if it was, I thought somebody was speaking. Sorry. Can I speak?
Does anyone else have a question? No, one more question. After this brother right here. Does anyone else have a question? Okay, so, all right, last question.
I was young once.
Sit down.
When I was young, I did a whole bunch of silly stuff. I'm wondering, beyond whether this queer stuff is actually true and verified and certified and you got a notary, beyond that, I'm wondering if there's any value in speaking about any person to bring up those things that they did when they were young, immature, and unformed. In other words, when we speak about a person, when we speak about them once they be, like in talking about masculinity, once he's become a grown-ass man, what do we do? And so, is there any value at all in taking up this amount of time and energy speaking about some things that he may have done when he was young? So, I feel like y'all kind of answered that on the previous question. I do think it's most of our conversation about this comes from the Q&A. We talked about other parts of Malcolm that I think we should continue to talk about beyond this one particular issue. But I do think it's noteworthy that the entire story of Malcolm is about a childhood of theft and all these other things. That we bring up all kinds of stuff Malcolm did his entire life and no one objects to it. It's only this particular issue where we suddenly only want to look at Malcolm after prison. It's an interesting piece to think about. I don't want to cut y'all off. I felt like I already answered the question. But it's an interesting question. I think we can continue to unpack and explore. But I think there are a lot of other things about Malcolm we can unpack and explore. And that's not to cut this short. If anyone wants to weigh in, I don't want anybody to feel silenced. But otherwise, I do want to just talk about this other piece of Malcolm, which is and this is the last question for y'all. What does it mean in the 21st century to think about not just Malcolm, but masculinity in the context of radical action and radical activism? You know, there's a conversation going on this week, for example, about reproductive justice. We saw what happened in Alabama. We see what's happening in Ohio, Missouri. There's some really interesting conversations. In many ways, it's being framed as a woman's issue. As a cis woman's issue, to be more specific. And I was thinking as this was happening, like, what would it mean for us to have a robust enough conversation about manhood and masculinity and gender more broadly, that we can think about that issue? Because that's a concrete material issue that's going to affect people's lives. Regardless of where you stand on the actual issue, how we're framing the issue is a thing. How we frame Trump, how we frame our resistance, how we frame community, how we frame Black Lives Matter, how we frame resistance. What does the future look like? What is the end game for us? You know, in terms of radical politics and radical movement, in terms of this question of masculinity.
So, we're in a community, our communities have long presumed that our leadership would be Black, male, and heterosexual. When you read Derek Bell's essay, The Last Black Hero, part of that short story is to jettison this idea that leadership can only emerge out of this particular framework, and understand the ways that we have rehabilitated intensely problematic Black men in order to hold on to this ideal that Black leadership must be Black and male and heterosexual. There are people still trying to rehabilitate another well-known Philadelphia son who's in a Pennsylvania prison right now, rather than deal with who that man was in particular context and why reasons why he deserves to be in prison. That being said, I think we're at a moment now in the 21st century, Black Lives Matter is really the first full public black radical movement that has had leadership that doesn't look like what black leadership has looked like for 150 years, right? And so as we're gesturing to different models of black leadership, it also entails a different way for black men to exist within these leadership structures. So I think that's why that conversation is as necessary now as any conversation is at this point in time.
I think it's important to, as you mentioned, in terms of thinking about history and in thinking about how we move forward in this moment and thinking about what space. I know some of the questions that have come up in movement spaces have been like, well, so what is the role of the black man if this is going to be, right, queer, black women, this, that, and the third, trans, and it's almost as though there's this real deficit feeling, right, that if there's not a space that is marked in this way, that is particular, and that reminds us of this kind of charismatic or messianic kind of model of leadership, then we're not going to get where we need to get. And I think that there's something that is already ingrained in the way, in our history, that tells us that leadership has always looked very different as well, right? That those models are the ones we've regurgitated, those are the models that we've been, in many ways, indoctrinated to kind of repeat and think, but there have always been these collective models of leadership. There have always been queer, trans, gender variant, etc. folks doing the work that is getting us free. The attachment to leadership and attaching that to a particular gender expression, I think actually traps us again. When I say a queering of, or I'm saying the opening up of possibility of, how much leadership have we missed in our search for this particular looking thing who meets these specific identity markers versus people who are living at the margins of the margins, right? Kind of going on to say advanced marginalization. What if we had a movement that was led by trans sex workers? What does that look like for us? How does that get us free? Or someone who's at the intersection of racism, transphobia, homophobia, right? The ways in which poverty is policed and criminalized, right? That are leading from there. That our leaders in this context, we get a more leaderful movement, to borrow language from BYP and other organizers in this moment, if we're actually looking for people who are thinking about black humanity and its wholeness and its fullness and its possibility versus narrowing the scope by which we think someone is qualified to do that. And I think part of opening up that is also opening up our kind of restrictive ways of looking at gender, of looking at sexuality, of looking at ourselves and how we show up in the world. I think folks who are really attuned to black humanity know that our expression has always been bountiful and limitless and infinite in its potential. Why would our gender expressions and sexual expressions be any different?
Wow. Mark Anthony Neal, Treva B. Lindsey, give him a round of applause, please. Again, we're gonna take, I'm gonna tell y'all 3 minutes. Y'all know how to act. We're gonna take a 3-minute break so that the next panelist can come up, and we will then get the next panel started as soon as they're up and settled. Again, while you're stretching, there's a restroom through that way. There's a restroom over at Uncle Bobbie's. All the books that we've mentioned today just about are over at the store. All of the authors' books are here at the store. Dr. Wesley Muhammad not only has his books in Uncle Bobbie's, you can buy them directly right there at the table right there. You can buy Uncle Bobbie's t-shirts directly right there. You can buy some of our food directly in the ante room. If you need change, we can do that too. Your money change right here in the temple. Whatever you need. Some of y'all non-heathens get it.